Hello, everybody, and welcome to an early morning, relatively speaking, early morning BTR stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, at LevPo on Twitter. Thank you so much for coming here, and be sure to subscribe. Today, we have the amazing Meta Nomad here with us, talking about the global lobotomy that we're currently facing and how we can get out of that situation. So I would love to start off with Meta. Just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you are the host of the amazing Hermetics podcast, where you talk about a lot of these very interesting occult philosophical things. So yeah, take it away, Meta. Just let us know how you got started first.
My background is like someone's fired a shotgun onto a CV because it doesn't make any sense. Like I worked in retail for a while, like most people, and then did my BA in fine art, and then I did my MA in continental philosophy. And around midway through my MA, I realized my master's, whatever you want to call it, I realized that I wasn't really into how the academy was doing things, and that's no comment on my tutors. All my tutors have actually been great, and it's a strange situation where actually I think most of the tutors and academics are agree with those people who are sort of critical of the academy, and I trying to figure out where the hostility towards the academy is coming from. But anyway, then I was in marketing for a while, and that was fine. Like, so I'd done the pretty standard route of modern man, I guess, and then I just exited all that, and through a friend became a carpenter for a while, and then coronavirus destroyed that business. And so this was about 2 or 3 months ago, and then so for those 2 years I was also running the podcast just out of pure passion and fun. I'm still doing that, of course, but then when I lost my job because of coronavirus, I basically was like, okay, there's only really one thing I want to do in my life, which is talk about philosophy and talk about ideas. So then I was like, if you're interested, if you like the podcast, please support me. And now luckily I have the support to run it full time. So now I'm full-time podcast host, chatting about things you were talking about. Hermetics, I was thinking about it the other day. If you Venn diagrammed Hermetics, it would be occultism, collapse, and continental philosophy. And then Hermetics is the sort of the combination of the three, and they actually all connect in some strange weird way.
Well, it's a very appropriate thing because Hermes was also the god of the threshold borders, among other things, if I'm not mistaken.
He was the god of, I mean, it's difficult when you talk about Hermes because historically Hermes also, when it turns to Greek, Hermes, so originally in Egypt, Thoth was thought of later as the Greek Hermes, so they sort of connect, but Hermes is the Greek god of messages, communication. Michel Serres talks about him a lot as the philosopher of communication, but then also interested in Hermeticism. But the name Hermetics, and it's not E, it's I, so it's Hermetics, is actually from the 9th tarot card. So Hermit, IX, is in 9, and then just put that together. But it's also Hermes and things like that. So it's about communication and communicating ideas. Always put the ideas first, as opposed to people and lame biographies, which I don't really have any time for.
That's a good way to go about it.
That's about it. If there's anything else you want to know, ask away.
Well, I wanted to get to the article and also look at what's going on right now with all of the people who are outside in the protests, who are kneeling down and laying their bodies down in different countries. So it seems like there is a mass movement going on of some kind of hive mind, which I think, I'm curious about your take on this. I think it is related to people going with whatever flow is triggering them into these states that are bigger than they are. Kind of like, I mean, I wouldn't make the comparison with the Third Reich, but when you would have so many people who are repeating the same action over and over again, it does become like a hive mind feel, and it makes me kind of nervous to see things like that and where exactly they would take us.
Yeah, well, it's sort of awkward that the example that we're given, but it is because it blew up so much, is this should we say, George Floyd event. Like that's how I'm going to describe it because I just see it as part of the spectacle. The reason that I wrote about this one straight away is because unlike the other ones, like Greta Thunberg was relatively harmless. It was just annoying. And then one, I was thinking about myself today. I was like, there's probably tons of events that I've forgotten, and one has just literally popped into my mind. Like, do you remember Extinction Rebellion? We had about 2 weeks of Extinction Rebellion, and in those 2 weeks, that was the single most important thing that ever happened ever to anyone who was commenting about it. And I imagine the same people who were taking part in that, and were also the same people who were taking part in the Greta Thunberg, they're taking part in this thing at the moment. And you can strip away what it's called or what they're doing, and you can just apply some. You can apply like an abstraction. You could just call it an abstraction of status. Like it's something that just increases your status, and it's a signal. And I'm not going into with this essay, I'm not actually trying to go near the whole virtue signaling thing because I just think that's I think that's kind of been and gone, that whole language of like virtue signaling, blah blah blah, SJWs, blah blah blah. No, it's bigger than that because it's to do with status and it's to do with what René Girard called mimesis. Like people copy each other, and it's so basic that it's sort of when I wrote the article that came out in the space of an hour, like it just banged it out and it just kept flowing and flowing. And I was like, yeah, this is at least this is how I see it. And of course, people disagree because they want to. That it's the sunk cost fallacy, right? It's the idea that you put time and effort into something, so therefore it must be right. And if you attack people who've sunk their time and their energy into something, and you say, actually, I don't think this is what this is at all, they just get angry. And all the it's the same as anything when you attack people on this. The retaliations are never concise or articulate. They're always ad hominem, like any attack on this, any fair criticism on this is racism. Any fair criticism on Extinction Rebellion is, let's say, like a pro-capitalist libertarian thing. Any criticism of like Greta Thunberg is like bullying or peer pressure or being mean. And for me, this actually just comes down to very relatively simple, sort of almost like game theory status dynamics, which is it's it's really difficult to point to the origin of where things start to flow, right? So you have this event that happens, and for some reason, out of all the other times this has happened, and same with climate change, like there's 1,000 things we could pick out of climate change to say, oh my God, look how bad it is. But for some reason, one of them just clicks the right buttons and it starts to flow. In the same way that there is 1,000, or if not probably 1,000,000 Greta Thunbergs out there that we could have found and said, look, this kid's amazing. Like if you go back to the 70s and the 90s and the 80s, there's like always this young girl at some point, obviously a different name, who is pointing out the same climate change injustices the whole time, and it is a repetition. And like the thing with this is it's just, for me, it comes down to a simple idea of status, which is you see a load of people agreeing with something, and unless you agree with it, you're going to become alienated. And it's simply, for me, it's simply that simple, that people are partaking in this because really for this it's a strange combination because COVID happened, and I wrote like a short follow-up called like I think it was hunger for nothing. So it's like everyone sort of had cabin fever at that point in time, and basically what you're seeing is the moralism and ethical standpoint of these protests overrode, or it overrides people's extra risk with regards to health and safety. So it's undeniable that in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, there is going to be one of the sharpest spikes in COVID-19. And we'll probably have to have 2 or 3 more weeks of sitting indoors because people went out. And, this is just one of those big hypocrisies where you say like, well, hang on, how come you can go out and do these protests when for weeks and weeks and weeks we've been sat inside, trying to stay healthy. So, but it's like, it's proof that of where society's priorities lie. And it's proof that there is sort of starting to form a hierarchy of like, okay, so social justice is top, and then there's public health. But then what about this? And then what about this? And things start to slide into place. And it seems to me that public health is probably near the bottom. But this, for me, I just want to make it clear, this has nothing to do, for me, like, this isn't an attack on George Floyd. This isn't an attack on Black Lives Matter, anything like that. I'm not interested in the politics. I don't care. For me, this is another event in a long line of events in the spectacle, which can all just be, it's almost like a Kantian distinction where like, whatever the name or the aesthetic of the event is, that's phenomena. Wipe that away, and behind it, you have the same event that's just gravitating the same people towards it time and time again. the people who just get caught up in groupthink, who get caught up in mimesis, who get caught up in like what Gustave Le Bon called the crowd, like the understanding that the only reason there's a herd, or in Nietzsche called it the herd, Heidegger called it the they, spectacle. There's 1,001 names for it. But for that to be a reality, there has to be the kind of people that will always gravitate towards that. And most of these people aren't thinking; they are just simply following the herd. And it's empty thought to say like, oh, they're such sheep. But at the end of the day, it's just another event which attracts the herd. And that's sort of a depressing answer, because it's like, oh, it's nothing new. It's like, yeah, it's nothing new. And but once again, like they've sort of got you in a stranglehold, because it's a moralistic and ethical and, shall we say, like socio-political signal of being good. Then inherently there's like a collective understanding that if you say anything other than anything that isn't positive about it, then you're against it and you're bad. And that is what I would call like the Disneyfication of society. And it was one of the things I was talking to John Michael Greer about the other day, where we have this idea now that if there's a tiny bit of something bad in someone, or someone has done one tiny bad thing at some point, they're entirely bad, right? You can't have someone who's like written, 10 hundreds of great books. Like, I don't know, take for instance, it happened on the left with Slavoj Žižek. He's written so many good books, but then he begins this like criticism of immigration, saying, well, actually, no, like we understand each other as cultures, but actually we do need the divisions. And it's like, right, we can't have him at all anymore. And that's the pure Disneyfication of culture. Is like, if you just criticize one tiny thing which everyone else considers good, then you're instantly bad, and everything else you say is bad. And that's how the Overton window contracts, because all that means is, if the Overton window is the window of what's considered acceptable to speak about within a society, then whatever is defined as good is like, you're fine to talk about that, you're fine to talk about that. And as soon as you go the other way, it isn't that you actually extend the Overton window that way, you're just completely outcast, and you're just deemed like, no, that person's horrible, we can't even speak about them, we can't even talk to them anymore. And I mean, most people are relatively aware of this, and it seems to me that if you get a chance to speak to people on an individual or even a small group level, then it's fine. Like, most people will usually listen. But as soon as you start going above sort of 3 or 4 people, forget it. Like, you can drag a horse to water, but it won't drink. Like, people just don't want to know. People don't want to think. And that's sort of the gist of the argument. I mean, I include some reasons why social media exacerbates the problem, and I include the fact that it's what really is the problem is that actually our time's being compressed. So
dopamine reward systems.
Dopamine reward systems, but we're being taught to live in increasingly smaller presents. So like the present of the Greta Thunberg thing was like, that was one present from start to finish. Now she's gone. She's not coming back. Start to finish, because she didn't keep up. If you notice, she's still going on about climate change. And if you go on, it's amazing. If you go on Greta Thunberg's Twitter, and I urge everyone who's listening to do this, go on it and look at her tweets, and look at, she's still posting about climate change, but they seem like they're from something like the 1970s now. That's how old they seem, right? Because we're taught like, right, that event's done. Unless you keep up, you're an alienated, sort of reactionary, old hack, archaic. And it's like, but we're taught to just stay in the present. And when that present's over, there is no connection anymore. There's no history. There's no formation. It's like present. And they're just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And dopamine reward systems basically exacerbate this effect by basically just teaching you to exist. Your whole existence rides on just waiting for the next tiny little buzz of proof that you're alive, basically.
I agree. It's a very strange time we're living in right now. And for the people who have read the article, I know, Gio, you were a big admirer of it. What would you say could be a way out, or a way to at least try to reach out to the people who happen to be in the hive mind, who may be on the border of being on the hive mind and at the same time being able to think for themselves, but maybe too, I don't know, scared by the rest of the hive mind to do something? This has always been something that's fascinated me, how we can reach out to people, and I'd love to open it up to more people. And Tim as well, with the newly shaved head. By the way, you are sideways. So, yes, there we go. Much better. So, well, let's start with Gio.
Kind of on the spot. I don't know about the solutions, but yeah, I did read the article. I'm a big fan of the Hermetics podcast, not to fanboy, especially the ones with Jean Michael Greer. I just love to hear him talk. But what Meta Nomad was speaking of reminds me, I actually have the book with me because I'm writing. I was gonna write. I'm still writing it, an article about the virus being a part of the spectacle. But this is section 3 from Society of the Spectacle. The spectacle presents itself simultaneously as all of society, as part of society, and as an instrument of unification, as a part of society, specifically the sector, which concentrates all gazing and all consciousness, due to the very fact that the sector is separate. It is the common ground of all deceived gaze and of false consciousness, and the unification it achieves is nothing but an official language of generalized separation. So I think Metanomad's analysis is correct in that we are seeing, you could call it a spectacle, a psyop, what have you. But it just, to me, it seems not entirely organic in terms of the response. It seems we are seeing the birth of a moral, secular, religious fervor, complete with golden coffins and symbolic gestures and so forth. The language that people are using is incredibly symbolic and sacred in some ways, but an inverted sacred, a counter-initiatory sacred. In terms of solution, I wouldn't know what to say. It's very hard to sort of break that frustration people have of being locked up and wanting to identify with something greater and something that has quite a real impact in people's lives in terms of criticism of such movements, because that's the ultimate trick, is to equate the moral with the political and so forth. Because if you're against it, like Nomad said, then people have lost their jobs just for saying all lives matter and things of that sort. So really, it is really a spectacle that has ingratiated itself within the everyday, within the they, and so forth. So yeah,
it kind of reminds me of the sparrows from Game of Thrones, what I was mentioning earlier. When, I don't know, Tim, would you agree? I don't know if you've seen Game of Thrones or not.
I read them, and then I stopped watching the show when they left the reservation. But for the most part, the blueprints in the show, or the blueprints in the books, would be an accurate representation of sort of what we're seeing now. We're seeing a cannibalized version of old faiths renewed with some concept of urgency that is being completely fabricated. The urgency is spiraling us into self-destruction faster and faster. We're carving away things that used to have meaning and attaching them to emotions instead of logic. And now if something offends your emotions, it has to be deemed evil. Like I think Meta Nomad he was talking about compressed time and how we're in an existence now where what happened last week, it's not existing in the same reality we live in now. The news cycle has become 8 hour instead of 24 hour. And if I can convince you that emotionally you need to agree with me by clipping video and putting it on Reddit, showing you the second half, I can have you agree with vicious violence because I'm telling you the narrative deems it or justifiable. And the notion separates you from what actually rationally and morally means correct or incorrect. Instead, you're running off of a pre-described narrative of 1 + 1 now equals 5, and if you disagree, you're the goddamn devil. And it's like, okay, we need to calm down because we're watching this. You're right. It's not just all lives matter now equates to someone, the German socialist from the 30s. It's getting to the point where if you don't just blindly agree with what is being said around you, you will be seen as an agitator or someone who is wanting this fictionalized narrative to get worse. If you try to point out, wait, you're on the wrong track with this line of logic or this line of reasoning, you'll be seen as someone who's perpetuating the negative side of that fantasy. And it's like, for someone who really likes fantasy and likes writing and reading fiction, that's fucking scary because this is beyond what this is. When people say, oh, well, 2000 was the end of the world, et cetera, Y2K was going to be the end before that. No, like I think that we've gotten in the way of a system that has been marching toward where we are right now for over 100 years. And I think that what we're watching now is more people waking up and realizing that the programmed helplessness and the learned futility of trying to resist is just overwhelming, and it might be easier to just order in and stay home and watch Netflix, and that's fucking scary.
Well, Robert Kusk, thank you, Robert, for joining us. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Has a comment. What about the Benedict option? just remove yourself from society and create a friendship bubble. Focus on local betterment. So I would love to hear from everybody, especially people who have not spoken yet. So let's start with Saturnalia and then Gravantis.
Sorry about the Benedict option. I'm not
Yes.
exactly.
Yes, I'm
I'm
curious if
sorry,
you have
I'm
any
not
thoughts
familiar
on.
with this idea.
So, well, I don't know what the Benedict option is other than the definition that Robert gives, which is if we're seeing these problems in society, we should remove ourselves. I don't know if it's based on the Benedictine monks. Maybe Gravantis would be able to elucidate on that. Actually, well, Gravantis, if you know exactly what this is talking about, let us know, because I'm also a little bit confused about the actual wording of Benedict option, other than just removing yourself from society to create a friendship bubble.
Yeah, the Benedict option, it was a book written by Rod Dreher. The idea based on Saint Benedict and the Benedictine monks. This idea that probably the best way to survive essentially is to sort of create independent communities. There's sort of criticism depending on how far you're going to go. If the idea is kind of like running out into the woods and just kind of separating yourself completely. Personally, I think, it's important to have those real, genuine connections, and we need to form those communities, but one can't entirely detach themselves from society just because society's not going to let you. I mean, you see these stories of people who try to run off and do their own thing, and they get shut down immediately. It's just
like a Waco.
Exactly. It's just not
Ruby
feasible
Ridge, yeah.
because, you're not going to be able to escape because they don't want you to. But I think it's important, that kind of idea of living in the world without being a part of it. That's what we should strive for, and having those genuine connections and communities with people who, share the same ideas and whatnot. That's kind of the real important part. So, I think it's a yes and no with the Benedict option.
Interesting. Made a Nomad, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is when I wrote Exiting Modernity, this was the whole point about sort of, I've never heard of it described as the Benedict option before, but it sort of works. There's a brilliant film on it, recently released actually, which was quite surprising, called Leave No Trace, which sort of abstractly outlines actually why that's just not a possibility. Which is why in Exiting Modernity, when I wrote that, my whole point is that it's, and this is I think what Rand Prieur has noticed, if anyone's familiar with his work, is that the exit there that Gravitas outlines the whole idea that like physically in a material space you can't just go like, I'm gonna go over there, I'm gonna buy that land, and I'm gonna put up a barn conversion, I'm gonna live in there and live off the land. And anyone in their right mind knows like there's 2 billion different forms and things and different people you're gonna have to contact and different systems you're gonna have to go through to even be able to, I don't know, buy the land. And then they'll go, oh no, it's X land, so you can't do this. And then if at the last minute they don't want you to use the land, they'll say, oh no, we've created this whole new thing, and we've redefined it as Y land, and you can't do that anymore. And they could do that at any point. So the whole point is like, no. So my thing was, yeah, but as Gravitas said, you're part of it, but you're not. You're in it, but you're not in it mentally. Okay, so there is possibilities. Because I don't want to go the whole pessimistic route, like, oh man, we're in it and we're stuck in this industrial hellhole. Like, what is the song by Godspeed You, Black Emperor? Like, the car's on fire and there's no driver at the wheel. It's like, no, chill out, man. Like, it's not all that bad because you're still you. And my whole point is, you still have your will to say whether or not you like certain things and whether or not you agree with certain things. And even if you're not let's say extrovertly allowed, or should we say covertly, like it's not of the correct etiquette to say certain things, you can there's still certain things that you can say which are so surprising to people that it just causes an absolute rupture in social etiquette. So one simple one is like, oh, have you seen Captain America? You go, I don't like Marvel films. Like, something as simple as that ruptures people's reality. And I know that sounds silly, but it's something that's so accepted that people are like, have people step back and go, hang on, I can question that. I can not like these things. I can, and the whole point is mental exit first, is stepping back and questioning. And it's like John Michael Greer's whole thing of the dancing animatronic Santa Clauses that are bought at Christmas. If anyone thought for more than a second about that purchase of those stupid little animatronics, they wouldn't buy them. And it's it's complete compulsion with regards to. So my whole thing is like step back and say, well, do I like this? So yeah, you might. It's like the Rampriere gives us an example of like, if you take there was a bird living in the woods, and what happened in the industrial society came along and it cut down the woods, and now there's a factory there. But the bird that lived in that woods is now living in the factory, and he's like, the bird is stealing the workers' lunches. And it's like the primitivists just want to come along and they want to burn the factory down and regrow the woods. And it's like, no, that's going to be your whole life's work. This is going to be put into burning down this factory. Don't do that. It's a stupid waste of your life and your finite energy. It sucks, but like at the end of the day, you're never going to have some utopian existence that you get to live within. So learn to live within the system that you're within, and learn to still be yourself within it as much as you possibly can be. And that starts with removing the things which have been put on you falsely. Okay, so many people don't realize the things that were initially controlling them, and the ways that they've been subconsciously controlled. Like, you think back to school, you were like a 6 or 8 year old kid who was basically like a stick of dynamite with regards to energy. Like, you put a kid in a field, he'll run around for hours. But where did they put you? They put you in a room under fluorescent lights for like 8 hours a day with a 1 hour break where you're only allowed within this confine. And that is outlined as normality. And that sticks with you. And it's things like that where you have to think back a bit. Well, hang on. Well, what else has that taught me? Okay, well, that's taught me the idea that you shouldn't roam around places in like a van. You shouldn't just wander aimlessly. You should always have this purpose. And it's always like everything has a use value. So the idea of exits, like, yeah, mentally, physically exiting, like I've known a few people who've done it, and it is an uphill struggle, but like you can get there. But the thing is, like, there's certain things in life, like if you've acquired them, so if you've got kids, man, stay away from this stuff. That should be your priority. Sucks, but you got to knuckle down and get on and keep quiet. If you haven't got like a kids or a mortgage, or if you haven't got a big career, then you've lucked out. But that's the thing. It's like mental exit first. Like the whole idea that it's too far gone. No. You can still be yourself, and you can still disagree with things. And disagreement starts on very, very basic things. And it starts by disagreeing with things which are so fundamentally accepted. Like one thing that people have started to do. Yeah, I don't want a mortgage. I don't want to go to uni. I don't want that debt. Why not? Because I don't want to be in a ton of debt. But don't you want a degree? Nope, not really. Why not? Because everyone's got them and they're not giving us anything anymore. Disagreeing with that's like an incredible start. But it's the whole thing again of like, if everyone not everyone wants to do that. It's like, it doesn't matter. Just do what you want to do. Just slow down. Like, do you actually want a mortgage? Do you want to be tied to that? What does a mortgage actually mean to you? Yeah.
It almost seems like we're creating a new intelligentsia online. And there's always existed various intelligentsias in history that have fought against whatever was the dominant paradigm at the time. Like even back in Imperial Russia, the intelligentsias back then were letting the anti-Tsar young people into their parties, and they were fascinated by them. Unfortunately, today, at least in the intelligentsia in New York City, for example, it seems like they might as well be on another planet. And this is something that I'm trying to fix right now by bringing in people from these worlds. Because, look, they also have kids, even though we had a conversation before we were talking about how different they actually are from us. Like Verse was making the point, Verse Laloon. I still think that it is possible to get some of the people who are in this much more woke generation that have never been exposed to the kind of things we've been exposed to so far to come in and bridge certain divides, at least to create the kind of community in a city like New York that's not going to turn into the sparrows in Game of Thrones. And, like, I see that happening in Seattle, I see that happening in Portland. In New York, we still have the NYPD, which has been able to have somewhat of a control over these riots that have been going on. But I think that could help not make things worse for the people who would want to, let's say, live in the world but not be of the world. But I'm interested in what you guys think, if there could be a possibility of bridging those divides as I imagine.
Yeah, I would say that there's a possibility to bridge the divide, so to speak. The biggest thing to remember is, and it's an unfortunate fact, but we live in a society, right? Well, if we're going to live in a society, that means that if something makes me uncomfortable, I have just as much to complain about it as 0.01% population who wants to have a third bathroom option. I'm saying that if anyone is individually upset, the way they're going to stop you from being talk about that is NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. They're going to remove what the definitions of words are, so that when you say, hey, that's racist, they get to say, no, it's not, because you're white. So it can't be racist to you. And we're watching this happen in real time. Webster's dictionary just agreed to change the definition of racist yesterday. So we're entering a world in which what words mean won't mean anything in the future. They're going to say that's not right because that assaults this group. They're going to say that group doesn't exist because the state says it doesn't. And you're going to have no choice but to agree. I say the idea of attacking the narrative, that's all you have to do. Exactly. You can say, I don't watch those movies. You can say, no, that doesn't make any sense. No, that's not. No, I'm not having this conversation. No, I'm not going to waste my time entertaining your delusion. Instead, we keep catering to the soft. We keep being gentle to people because they're having dreams. I don't know if you guys have kids or raised even animals. If you've bred any sort of livestock or even raised dogs, if it shits on the rug, you can't reward that behavior. And if you try to talk to it about why'd you go to the bathroom on the rug, instead of aggressively explaining, no, this will not get a positive reaction out of me. Like, you have to learn. And if you won't learn, I have to teach you. And it's unfortunate that we're getting to the point people think that, well, if you're uncomfortable with something, the thing has to change. It's like, no, that just means you're uncomfortable with it. Now let's have a talk about why. And the why is getting lost. So I think if we're going to push back and form a rogue intelligentsia, if we're going to establish an ability to communicate that's outside of the norm, we need to be willing to be offensive, because the idea of free speech is not protecting things I already wanted to hear. The idea of free speech is protecting your ability to say things I didn't want to hear. The idea of the left being anti-establishment, that used to be a beautiful thing. They used to say, yeah, if I want to hold hands with my boyfriend, I shouldn't get pelted with bricks. I agree, you shouldn't. But now it's gone to the where, okay, well, if you don't want to watch Drag Time Story Hour, you're the problem. And it's like, wait, no, how did we changed conversations? We jumped tracks.
But then would the problem also lie, though, in people who imagine that if they were to pelt people who they didn't like with bricks, who they see as upsetting the great chain of being social order, to them that would be the only way they'd be able to retain the social order and not create the situation we're in today. And I disagree with that. But what would you or anybody else say about people who want to go all the way back to those times and are looking at something like very traditional Islamic societies as being even better than what we have here? Because because they're able to have all these very draconian laws that keep that keep society functioning in this very particular way.
That's why I said it's 100 years long. I'll let someone else take over after this is my last comment on the subject, I suppose. But look, it's been going on for longer than we're being made aware or being made to believe, and it has been getting to the point where if I push you, Hegelian dialectic, I can make you ask me to give you the thing I wanted to give you all along. If I wanted to come in there and say you can't have a gun, all I need to do is make sure people shoot each other and you get scared. Then you'll say, please take our guns away. If I want to make sure you don't go to war and make sure you collapse the economy, I have to terrify you into staying home. And people are stupid panic beasts, especially when they're afraid. It drops every year. They lower the bar so that the 100, the mark for what's considered to be bright, gets lower every year. So take the lowest common denominator. I'm not making this up. Like, you have to have humanity enemy. Itself as an enemy. Enemy is fucking winning because we're too afraid to call it out because we're being manipulated to fight each other. This proxy war shit has been going on for longer than saying it to you in these vibrational tones. Well, it's fucking frustrating. And I know a lot of you know what I'm talking about. We're all afraid to mention. We all have extensities in some capacity. This pattern. What's happening to us? But instead, see ourselves as oppositional. So we won't come together and talk about it. We'll just say we're going to blame obvious systematic decline that is leading us into yet another totalitarian regime, and it's going to be this time global, and that's fucking terrible to me.
Well, isn't that what Yuri Bezmenov talked about? I'm sure everybody here in the panel knows who Yuri Bezmenov is, the ex-KGB guy who talked about demoralization, then leading to another authoritarian structure. And this is why, like, I also see people, just recently we were having a discussion that I'm going to get back into on Sunny's Twitter about Russia. And this, to me, is a signifier of, oh, people don't like some of the things we're seeing right now with, like, the Drag Kid Story Hour and all that they're willing to bring back this very based, as it were, authoritarian regime to take its place.
Pendulum, man. Pendulum. You push me hard left, hard right will come. Watch Generation Z is the most homophobic and racist generation we've seen in 3 going back. 3 of them. I interact with these kids all the time online. They're flocks to... Dude, it's black. They're miserable. They're angry and they're rejecting everything because they're seeing nothing but the negative side effects, and they don't care about the justice side of it. They're only going to affect their life negatively in front of them, and they're like, no, I don't want to hear about blood play in school. That's not a sex thing I hear about. My 8-year-old brother doesn't need to hear it either. All these people are sick. These people are sick part, that group, the me versus you, that's going to keep getting worse, because the more you tell me the establishment's telling me to. How did the establishment said, don't be loud, don't dye your hair funny colors. Guess who the establishment is now? People dyeing their hair. What do you think's about to happen? 1928. What was happening in 1928 in Europe? Gay Berlin, gay city on the planet. Look. And then what happened after Weimar Republic fell? The leading cause of death was suicide. People were very sad and upset. And someone said, you guys don't need to be sad. You be happy and be proud of yourselves. Be proud of your nationalist country. And next thing you know, old Jed's a fucking millionaire. Like...
By the way, Tim, there's a bit of a problem with your Wi-Fi. I'm not sure if it's where you happen to be sitting right now, but it's kind of going in and out. But I wanted to bring this also back to Meta Nomad. Curious if you have any thoughts on this other swing of the pendulum that we may be seeing from the Zoomers, as far as the things that they're fighting against, whether a lot of that is just ironic or whether it would lead at a certain point, big reversal that we're going to experience horrors we haven't seen in a very long time.
I had a question for Meta Nomad on that subject.
Yeah.
About just the compression. You spoke about how there's been this compression that's contributed to this global lobotomy. And if and some people are looking at the Black Lives Matter thing, that's also triggered protests and riots in other countries. And it does seem to be symptomatic of some global messaging. Lev put it as a hive mind. I tend to think it's part of a larger egregore, which is like a collective thought form. And I think that makes it easier to think of like a lot of different types of egregores, only there's one that's overwhelmingly produced by what Moldbug calls the cathedral. But when you say the more you compress something, the act of uncompressing it like creates like a harsher spring back. And I would hope that that's not always the case, because you could think of a large file that's compressed and opening it costs like no energy. And if you think about opening a bottle of soda, right? Like there's all that compressed carbonated air, but if you open it just right, it'll just go like you can kind of like get it open without an explosion.
I see where you're coming from, but there is some mistakes there with regards to you're saying there's no energy involved in those forms of compression. So you're taking this idea of time compression, so the idea of like it's compressing one way and it's eventually going to spring back the other way. You're saying, well, if it's compressed like a file or like a carbonated drink in a bowl, well, actually there is a ton of energy holding them things and allowing them to be compressed. Like you've got the whole computer system allowing that to be decompressed in an orderly manner, which metaphorically you'd say you'd need this extremely ordered system to allow a decompression to happen orderly. Or with the bottle, you have this like, you have the plastic and the carbonate and you have the screw top. You have to have this extremely ordered bottle. And like, I want to repeat what Tim was saying, because I think it's really important. I'm of the sit back and just watch it happen camp and try not to get too emotionally invested. But like what was happening in the Weimar Republic, it is mirroring what is happening now, except with time compression, it's happening in a tighter time frame. And we're just going to see so if you imagine a band being pulled back to the left, the further and harder you pull that band, the further and harder and faster it's going to go right. Like, they are pulling that band to the absolute limit, okay? And I'm not sure it's going to even swing right. It's just going to break. And then the people are going to go, we should never do that again. That would be the worry for anyone who wants some form of peace and equilibrium in their lifetime, is stop pulling it now, at least if it goes rightward. I'm not of anything anymore, because it's like, for me, it's always cyclicity, because anyone who's on the right is going like, yeah, it's going to go back rightward. It's like, yeah, but also you do realize it will go right, and then it'll go back left again. That's history. It's cyclicity. And there is, if you think about that as a horizontal line, so it goes right and left and cycles, blah, 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 and pendulum swings, there is diagonals that come in, like tsunamis destroy cities. There's things which slice it up. That's why Hegelianism is largely crap, right? Because there's unpronounced things which can happen. But as far as I can see, I just can't see how people are being so blind to the fact that, like, they are just pushing it to its limit. And like he said, Gen Z, they don't want anything to do with it. They want nothing to do with it, because they haven't had. The problem that I see is that all the things that the generations that are talking to Gen Z and are saying, these things are great for you, these things are really good, they didn't have the prior experience which those generations are telling them, right? So Gen Z has just had rubbish. They've had debt, they've had student loan, they've had overpopulation, they've had like violence and riots constantly for like the last, since what? Like, so if anyone who's 20, it's been since the year 2000. Okay, so anyone who's 19, it's been since like 9/11, and since then it hasn't been nice at all. Anyone who's, let's say, 12, it's 2008 since the market crashed, and they haven't had anything good. And I think everyone who's understood fascism as it comes along, and it's like, the problem is the left is entirely postmodern, and it's like there's no such thing as two genders anymore, and it just has ended up to this point where there's no meaning in that. And then it's like there's no such thing as borders and nations. Okay, so there's no meaning in that. The idea of a family is being dispersed. Okay, there's no meaning in that. Every single thing is saying there's no meaning. Everything is neutral or vague or just a fluid plane of absolute meaningless stuff, right? So guess what? When you were born in that, there's absolutely no way to anchor your identity or who you are or what you want to do within that. So guess what? When someone like Jordan Peterson comes along and goes, here's 12 steps to make yourself a better person, however vague and fluid or sort of trite and cliche those steps are, to someone who's never had anything like that, that is going to seem like the Messiah has walked in. So guess what? When the next charismatic person who's right leaning or libertarian leaning or nationalist leaning comes along and it's smart enough to covertly get through the system, you won't stop people. They'll go, this guy is actually finally giving some meaning to the postmodernist stuff that was also going on in the Weimar Republic. And this isn't because I'm for it. This isn't because I'm against it. All I'm saying is I'm sympathetic to the idea that history just runs in cycles, and we're getting to near the end of this one. And unfortunately, the end of a cycle and the start of a new one is the worst part, right? So that's the sucky bit. Like, yeah, it sucks you happen to be born at this bit, which is exactly why I say mental exit, because it's like, step back, don't get part of these collectives, sort out your own life, tidy up your own house, tidy up your own affairs, sort out your own mind. What do you like? What do you enjoy? Get that in order first, because just don't get caught up in these collectives right now, because they have no clue what they're doing. Right? That would be my...
Since you live in England, I'm curious what you think of this take where in the early 20th century, from what I understand, the British government made sure that it would not turn communist, and part of it was appeasing the people through various social programs. So one way that I could look at the situation right now, where the protests that are going on, they are less bloody than the ones in the Crown Heights riot or the Los Angeles riots in '92, and not as violent as, let's say, the late 60s. So could there be an element that we are overlooking here of the powers that be understanding that all this woke stuff is nonsense, but at the same time trying to have people, vent their steam out and kind of like just subvert whatever it is that's going on, so that it could be business as usual. You let the people vent and you control the situation so that it does not get too out of hand. Is there any room for what I'm saying in what's happening right now?
Oh, so it's like a controlled. Well, let me just get this straight. Let me get this straight because I just want to emphasize this is nothing to do with. For me, this is nothing to do with the BLM riots, right, or protests, whatever you want to call them. The event. It's an event. What it's to do with if coronavirus had happened, like if you flip these events around, we wouldn't have had the protests, and if you'd had the Greta Thunberg thing happen at this time, the explosion still would have happened because everyone was just locked inside, ready to explode. Because no one wants, because we've been taught not to do that, and everyone's. But that's just social programming. I mean, I don't really understand what you meant with the British thing. You were saying about like we didn't want to term communist. I mean, arguably the NHS is like probably the clearest socialist program of healthcare on the planet.
Absolutely, no, there are definitely elements in there.
I'm in agreement with all of that. Basically, all economies are combinations of capitalist markets with socialist elements. Like you won't find pure socialism or pure capitalism anywhere. Like that's. I mean, and I don't.
Well, for example, for something more recently, what would you say it was that prevented Corbyn from getting elected?
Oh come on, that's easy.
Well,
what prevented?
Explain a bit for us Americans who are not as familiar.
Man. Okay, let me explain this for you. Let me explain what happened. Do you want me to start with Brexit? Because this is simple as dimple. Right?
Go for it.
What happened was, in the 90s, this man called Tony Blair came along and he converted Labour into an affluent, middle-class political thing, which completely ostracized the entire working class support which it had been built upon. So all of a sudden, the entire, like almost 100% of the support you've been built upon, you ostracize them in favor of people who were charging towards a minority, right? Because actually, for a long time, the working class was seen, right? Does that make sense? Like the problem that the reason they went to Labour is that the majority that were the working class, they were getting the tidbits, and they were seen as a minority, right? But anyway, Tony Blair came along and he converts the whole thing into an affluent middle class. So what have you got left? You've got the Green Party, which aren't going to get in because their policies were stupid. You've got Labour, who are then supporting middle class stuff. You've got the Conservatives, and then you usually would have like the BNP or the UKIP, which is the hard far right. But their manifestos and their, let's say, MPs were never smart enough to be able to control it. Nigel Farage was, right? He played the game very well. Anyway, so what happens then? Well, actually, the working class had nowhere to go. So what happens? For years and years and years, the working class had absolutely nowhere to go. Brexit comes along, and the EU, us joining the EU, which systematically did take a serious amount of jobs away from the working class, that choice comes along, and it's the first choice in years that was truly one for the working class. So no doubt that happened. But did Labour learn anything from that? No. So the reason why Corbyn lost is he continued that trajectory of simply he wasn't listening to the working class, right? He wasn't listening to the working class. He was just going deeper and deeper and deeper into affluent middle class neighborhoods and just working towards minorities, right? Now, sure, working towards minorities, it's a noble cause, but you can't forget the majority. That is the problem that they made, is you can't go, oh, look how great we are, look how great we are. Because politically, that's never going to work for you, because ultimately your voter base is only going to be the minority of people, which is a silly thing to do. And why did he lose? Because Dominic Cummings, largely, and Boris Johnson were smart enough to see, oh, look at these thousands and millions of people who've been ostracized, alienated, and need a clear, coherent, semi and pseudo nationalist voice with meritocracy underpinnings, like you work and you will get good pay. And where did Boris Johnson primarily do his campaign trail? The North. So that's why Corbyn lost, and that's why he lost amazingly. I mean, I had work the next day at like 8 a.m. and I still sat up till 3 because I just couldn't get the tears of laughter off my face quick enough. That it was so simple. I don't see like he is just not. It was the worst. Everything Corbyn did was a misstep. Everything.
The reason I bring it up is you have somebody like Boris Johnson, let's say, who went to Eton. You know, he is part of the quote-unquote elite. While the choice that he gives, I think it is like the best out of the worst choices so far. So would you see that there is still room for an elite, as long as it's a healthy elite, which we talked about with Gio before, where they would be able to steer things in the right direction and in a way take over the woke capital and be able to steer it in such a way that all the SJWs get their point across, get a time to vent their frustrations out, but ultimately it wouldn't turn into a communist dictatorship or a fascist dictatorship if the pendulum swings the other way.
Oh, you're wondering whether or not they're going to be able to, the Conservatives are going to be able to achieve this?
Yes, and not just in England, but in general.
In general.
Yeah, well, let's start with England. Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the start of England. I mean, I don't see it as being in England. Because for me at the moment, it seems to me that Dominic Cummings is running the show, and it seems to me that he doesn't care about left or right. It seems, is a libertarian at heart. He wants free trade. He wants exit. He wants laissez-faire markets. He just wants, like, he doesn't, he's one of his things when he was on about the weird those misfit thing where he wanted more people in number 10 who weren't from that outfit, was like, oh, there's $1 trillion notes laying on the floor. It seems to me that he's all about productivity and profit and having like a productive industrious nation as opposed to anything else. And I think anything else for him would be so I mean, I if I could outline how to do this, then I'd be a politician. Not that I ever want to be. I think I'd blow my own legs off if I ever became a politician. But I think the thing that they need to do is to make it okay, publicly make it okay for people to voice their support for their nation or for their ideas. And once small groups start to do that again, and they start to be honest about what they actually believe, it will snowball, and people will it'll come back, because they keep pushing it, and the longer they push it, the more worrying it becomes. Because, like we said, you keep compressing. And it's like you could, it's a bit abstract, but you can apply thermodynamics to politics. At the end of the day, there's only so long that you can keep pushing energy down until it eventually just erupts.
And is the current administration in England pushing it that same way as some forces are in America, or no?
They're playing it relatively well. I mean, they haven't actually done too many sort of token gestures, because I think at this point, right, the thing that amazes me is how the left can't see that all the output from industry and corporations and politicians isn't just token. Like, they don't mean it. They want you to buy things. I don't understand why that ever came to be a thing where corporations said, like, we support this, we support that. It's like, I don't care. You're a corporation. Private businesses was the thing that worked, and now you're ruining it. And I think it seems to me that Conservatives are playing it relatively well, that they're not doing too many sort of statements like that, and they're just getting on with things, which is what people really want. It's just, they just want, what amazes me is, like, for the last, when did Brexit start? 20, I can't even, like, it's been a long, for the past 5 years, all I've heard on the news is, like, things which just do not affect anything even remotely close to everyday existence. So it's been like Brexit, and then fair enough, Corona is unavoidable, but then it's been like other forms of like social and cultural politics. But it's like, when are they going to start talking about, like, here's what's happening with the roads, or here's what's happening with pollution, or here's what's happening with, I don't know, like, anything practical that actually affects. And this is what people are getting sick of. What a very smart politician would do is, honestly, and this sounds ridiculous, but if I was in power now, I would build the 8th wonder of the world to prove that kind of thing can happen again. And it would actually be an abstract proof that we've actually done something, right? Because no one can see anything that politicians have done. It's like, well, what's going on? You're just in power, but nothing's happening. We've still got the same shit, But if you built like a giant druid statue, then I think people would vote for you.
We have a comment, by the way, from Aura Taxonomy. The analysis of the lobotomy situation is good, but I'd like to hear Maida say some more about his thoughts on how to dodge the lobotomy. Is it just avoid media, do what you enjoy doing?
I've spoken a lot, so if anyone else wants to jump in their ways, then
Oh, and by the way, I just want to say I love Tim's background with the deer.
Oh, sorry. I'm going to give 2 cents on that, since we're just finishing up on Dominic Cummings. The big problem here is the fourth estate. The big problem here is the media arm. It's open propaganda. I'm watching information yesterday about a shooting in Seattle where they took a Hispanic man and lightened his flesh tone for CNN to call him a white supremacist. I've got both images. He's obviously Hispanic. We have the Fourth Estate making up complete fabrications. And when you looked at Dominic Cummings going to war with the media, what was it, 2 weeks ago, where they were following him around, none of them were social distancing. They're clamoring over each other in the street, none of them wearing masks to take pictures of him because he's not staying indoors. And it's like, you guys are the enemy of the people. You're not telling the truth. You're trying to push a narrative so desperately. You're clamoring over each other because someone else isn't social distancing properly. Like it's hypocrisy at its best, but it's not just hypocritical. It's pushing a narrative. Like you're saying before, they don't believe this shit. They don't really believe. It's tokenism. It's not just tokenism. It's like, what is it? A Yorkshire tea coming out to say, oh, well, it's a shame a conservative drank our brand, but we're going to support Black Lives Matter. That is a political decision. That's not a corporate decision. So now we're talking oligarchies. We're talking plutocrats. We're talking systems of government that don't involve nationalism. Systems, it's like, to some degree, and I don't want to get like tinfoil hat about it, but it reminds me of when you talk to people who say that they are satanic, that they have Satanist beliefs. They're not Christian, even though they're using the bad guy from the Christian Bible. Like, it's like me saying I believe in Voldemort, but Harry Potter isn't. It's like, so that's not really what you're talking about. You're talking about an esoteric concept, something bigger than the dynamic of that book or that belief system. You're talking about worshiping something else. So if you talk about worshiping like the Jacobin destruction of society, we're watching that. We're watching it happen. Like you said before, we're targeting every aspect, from family to language to dog ownership to what you eat to what you wear, what you're allowed to say, who you're allowed to hang out with. We're targeting what gods you're allowed to worship, who you're allowed to sleep with, who you're allowed to say is attractive, what you're allowed to say is attractive. We're attacking every aspect. And you're right, if you're a kid that just grew up, if you're 17 now, the world you're growing up in, the reality that has been built for you is cruel. It's oppressive. And the fact that you won't be allowed to speak your mind if something makes you uncomfortable, if you have a psychological stress response and you get repulsed by something you see advertised, if you say, I don't like that, you're going to be called a bigot. You're going to be called the problem. And we have a media that is complicit with at least 75% of local government and federal government in every major Western country that's saying the same exact thing. The only people that are disagreeing are like Poland and Hungary, and they're getting called every name you can because they're saying no. And it's like, so no one's allowed to have an opinion. It's a global coalition, acts as an allies, but it's almost as if it's only one coalition and everyone that's disagreeing isn't even allowed to unite with each other for fear of being called names. So if you want to resist this programming, the first step wouldn't just be to isolate yourself. It would be isolate yourself from certain negative messaging and try to see the world in a way that makes sense to you logically. And if what someone's telling you is obviously bullshit, avoid that. Avoid it. It's like I used to watch Tim Pool every day. I haven't watched Tim Pool in months because I can't stomach it anymore. I start to throw it up.
Well, Tim Pool announced himself that, look, guys, I'm going to have to do these really long-form videos for the algorithm. He already announced in advance what he was going to do for the sake of being able to continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's the algorithm aside, it was the ideology that started to get to me. It's the fence sitting, because I understand if I can put a drop in every bucket, then everybody will support my content, and he's a millionaire now. He's literally a millionaire. He knows what he's doing. But that fence sitting stuff is getting people killed because they're so depressed and stressed because they're being fed a negative narrative from 75% of the stimuli in their environment. And now you have someone else saying, yeah, well, CNN's right. Maybe coronavirus is going to kill everyone you know. And now the suicide rate just jumped up 40% in the 3 months of lockdown. Like 40% of what we had in 2019 happened in 3 months in California alone. So we're talking narratives that are costing lives, and people are trying to be polite so they don't say anything. What the fuck is going on? That's beyond evil or sadistic. That's profit. You're putting a profit margin for your advertisers ahead of the truth to the degree that it is killing people. So like, I don't see how this is a discussion that needs to be had politely. I think we need to start shutting things out and ripping out plugs. And to some degree, that's where the pendulum theory freaks me out, because I'm not down for that hard right shit. Half my family isn't white. I'm not down for some sort of weird neo-Nazi version of anything in which we're going to play litmus tests with each other over our belief systems. I mean, my grandmother had a life partner named Nancy for 26 years. I'm not down for people to tell people what they can and can't do. I'm just saying you can't tell me I have to agree with you. And that statement alone now is going to get people marked as the problem, when that's the only rational voice I'm hearing is, hey, don't tell me what to do and think, do you, man. That should be enough. Instead, we're getting riots over that. It seems backwards. It seems like it's getting ramped up, and compressed. And when it does pop out the other end, I prefer the version of the band just breaking. I don't think this is an air rifle with the spring getting pushed and the pellet leaving. I think the spring is going to get pushed and the walls are going to blow out. and it's like infodemic, they called it. You guys remember the infodemic stuff from a few months ago right when COVID started? Infodemic, you can look it up as a term. It was a mockingbird term. Every agency was saying the same terminology on every channel. We're approaching an infodemic, all this fake news. Well, they're going to create an infodemic, so then they can restrict all the access to information. They're going to say non-credible sources can't be listened to because they're dangerous to the establishment. It seems really toxic. It scares the shit out of me.
I'm very interested in this concept of the psychic life and how some words have been tainted to interfere with communication. And then also, we were talking about Black Lives Matter earlier, and how if you want to contribute to the conversation in a way that's not in like head nodding agreement, then you're kind of ostracized in ways. And I think it's a big issue that people in political conversations have is sometimes it's a situational awareness. I saw a comic from SNL made a really good point. It's like if your wife came to you and said, "Hey, honey, do you love me?" And you go, "Well, I love everybody." She would probably get very upset. And it has to do with situational awareness, right? As in the very specific context. And the problem is that people can bully with language. And what I would be afraid of is because you have what seems like this fifth estate. Like if anyone knows the movie about Julian Assange with Benedict Cumberbatch, they even like feature the Guardian in an eerie way, like the inside of the Guardian magazine, and they have like marks on the wall. I think they have like Mao Zedong on the wall. And so I wonder if the film, while very neutral in depicting Julian Assange in the Fifth Estate, but also kind of showing what some of these like mainstream establishments were, if they're like in a and how maybe these institutions are having a psychic, like for lack of a better word, effect on people in these shared thought forms. But nonetheless, you don't want the response to be equally bullying. So if, let's say, we're being bullied by the mainstream establishment to like think a certain way, or there's like an initiation, like a hazing initiation to be able to like converse in polite society, where like some people just want to have a more gruff conversation. Like not everyone like wants to like aim for the same level of granular accuracy or nuance. And some people, like when semantics come up, they'll get exhausted. It's just like the eyes start to roll. They're like, why are we talking semantics? Don't you know what I mean? And that is a problem, is that it never matters what you say. It matters what people hear. It doesn't matter what you mean. It matters what people interpret. And if people are programmed to interpret you as bigoted for the lack of situational awareness, for a similar circumstance of your wife coming to you and saying, "Honey, do you love me?" And you going, "Honey, I love everybody," right? As in, and so you have to
Isn't
decide.
that kind of like what happens with Jesse Lee Peterson when he asks, like, "Do you love white people?" And then they say, "I love all people."
I think
It's exactly
he's. I think the thing is, people do, unless you're an anonymous account with a pseudonym, like you have to take into account your theory of how people see you. You have to take into account like the current climate, and then you have to take into account what you can communicate, what you're willing to communicate, and what would be the most constructive way to do that. And sometimes you're talking into concepts like dealing with cramps, and the best way to deal with a cramp, is you really got to dig into it, and it's like a very uncomfortable feeling. And some people are made of sterner stuff than others. But I think this is the challenge too. You don't want, like, if you have a global awakening, it would be much better to not revert into like a like a bizarro bullying where, okay, you've been bullying us with language for so long and ostracizing us for so long for not playing your semantic games. Now suddenly we're using Lindy terms and we're talking about all sorts of stuff that if other people don't get up to speed without us lifting them to our level or bringing ourselves down to their level in good faith so we can rise together, you're I'm afraid you would be feeding negative feedback loop that you have an opportunity to overwhelm into a positive feedback loop instead.
I want to bring this conversation to Saturnalia. Tim, you were mentioning Satanism, and I would love to find out more about what the influence of the occult is on the current situation that's going on. But also I wanted to quickly add before that is that part of me still thinks that's what's going on right now among some of the elites at least, is a let baby have its bottle type of scenario, where maybe I want to consider if we did not appease a lot of these very violent, chaotic forces in some way through the woke media, what would happen? I mean, maybe it would have been great if we don't appease them. Maybe they would just go away. But maybe things could get a little bit worse afterwards. So we don't have to touch on that right now if nobody wants to at this point. But let me know, and then we could move on to the occult.
I think I kind of have something that links into this in both respects. So I kind of almost like to frame this as a question for Metanomad, if that's okay. The most interesting portion of his article to me was his description of this sort of syncretic system of control, almost control with a capital C, or like control in like a Burroughsian sense from like Nova Express or something, where there is he describes this widening of, or this shrinking of permissibility within the Overton window. I would also sort of say that I think there's been a widening of possibility due to basically free flow of information over the internet, but that's created a world where so much is possible, but nothing is permissible within this system, right? And that that sort of sorry, I'm flipping through my notes a bit more, but this sort of combined control system, Metanomad describes it as sort of literally impoverishing the will, which you could think of definitely in an occult sense, like will with a capital W, true will, wherein so if you're exercising your true will in an occultic sense, your actions are based on your true intentions. You're seeking your true meaning, I suppose. So does Metanomad think that sort of a rediscovery of the, let's say, ability to actuate or participate consciously with will is the solution to this sort of control system?
Yeah, in short, yeah. But there's a great book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance by Ioran Culiano, who talks about how advertisements are just another form of magic. So like people, it's interesting. I mean, we will have all bought and purchased things and been interested in things which we were never truly interested in, but we bought them on like a whim. And there's no such thing as a whim. All that is an advert or a marketer who has sort of gained control of your will just for a brief moment because you let your guard down. So it's like you see an advert and it's latching on to your will, and it's like, oh, I want that thing. And then next thing you know, you get home and you think, well, actually, I don't really know where that came from. And all that is some strange form of magic. I mean, people can call it whatever they want. They call it like game theory or behavioral economics or whatever. I mean, I do prefer to see it in the occult sense because I think it's actually more versatile in what we can do with it. But yeah, it is a control mechanism. But you mentioned about the Overton window and it extending what we believe. I don't see that at all, because or extending what's it's not permissible, but what's potential. It's like I don't see any of these potentials. People's like ideas of what government could be are still on the same basic ideas of like someone's in charge or a group of people are in charge and everyone else just does that. And it's like I don't want any of these. I don't want to be led. Where does my vote go? And or like, you know, which is why Moldbug, when Moldbug came along, whatever you think of Moldbug, the idea of patchwork was so nice and it was so refreshing. Same with like seasteading or localization or like fragmentation. It's like this is so refreshing because everything I've heard like for the past, you know, 10 years has just been forms of unification and like there's going to be this leader or there's going to be this group of people and it's like a and it's all pseudo democracy and just sort of really pithy and I just but yeah, like it ties in with the occult, sure. I will just comment, but like before we move too far on, because I noticed in the comment, if people don't mind, some guy was like, well, what are specific ways? I do list some specific ways in the article. So one is like beginning to use your phone as little as possible. Like for me, there's this amazing advert recently regarding phones, mobile phones specifically, where like all it is this song which says amazing camera, amazing screen, and something else, but it doesn't mention texting, it doesn't mention communication, it doesn't mention calls. These aren't devices for that anymore. These are like just they're not even portable computers. I don't even know what they are, but they're just things that they are pure ligaments that we have to have. Get rid of your phone, and I don't mean like put it down for an hour, but especially at meals, that's really important for various occult reasons. But one really big thing is go for a walk without your phone, and absolutely everything changes. Because if you have your phone, you're still tethered to like this immediacy of culture. It's like people will get panic and anxiety attacks going places without their phone because it's like you're going to be left out. You're no longer attached to this system, which is like, oh, I need to know the news. I need to know this. I need to know that. But other than that, I mean, you know, I list continually check your thoughts. Like, do I actually like this? Yeah, I've already said that. But people always go, oh, yeah, that's really easy. But it's actually not, because it doesn't mean just go to the supermarket and think, do I want this? It's like, seriously think, you know, if you're buying, I don't know, you always bought orange juice or something. Don't just think, do I want this? Because you'll just inevitably go, yeah. Think like, well, why did I originally want this? You know, what has compelled me to ever want this, etc., etc. And really think about it. I know it sounds silly, but it's a seriously important thing to do. Some form of routine which is outside of all this, like I do a short meditation or a contemplation or like a journaling, like write down. You just need to have control of your thoughts. The one that people got annoyed with was read old books. Now, and I said preferably before the 1900s. Now, I said, oh, it really alters your psyche and how different things were just 100 or so years ago. Now, it's strange because what I meant by this was actually the opposite. It does show you how different things are, but it also teaches you how alike most things are as well, like how we haven't changed except aesthetically. But in terms of technology and what we assume to be normal, so much has changed, but so much is on a cultural and like human level and personable characteristic level, we've remained so the same. So reading that, you start really realizing, oh, like this is all cycles. This, it's like John Michael Gray goes on about how there's tracts in Rome and things we found from Rome where there was the equivalent of Roman boomers complaining about teenagers racing their chariots, and also like the music that teenagers like, which obviously to us would be classical. Like they hated the music; it was really loud and obnoxious. It's like nothing new under the sun. It'll all come around again. You know, Nietzsche goes on about washed upon the shore. Like, yeah, everything begins again, which is like, it's Greer's point was with occultism and with like or esotericism or with religion. I know they've got a couple of Orthodox Christians in here. What that is to remove you from this sticky cyclic shit. Take a step back, realize who you are, and to be able to actually just like clunk yourself out of that. It's like a painful process. Also, like, this is why I've collapsed, but this is why I've talked to so many collapsed people, because the assumption that things can't end is just profound. Like, people literally think that it just can't end. That's mad. So read a book on a failed religion or revolution or a dead civilization. You know, read like a book on Jonestown, or read a book on Waco, or read a book on I don't know, civilization.
Or the larger cycles, like Graham Hancock talks about there being these cycles of destruction and creation, and it is very funny how in a lot of these myths, so many cultures share the same flood myth, and they all result in like a few survivors remaining to rebuild civilization. It's almost as if if this was something that happened multiple times, as in this is a world not as an accident for humans, but as something for us to experience with all our five senses, then there would be part of this game, for lack of a better term, a reshuffling, a shaking of the board, where we would have a few survivors that would restart again like a phoenix.
Makes logical sense. I mean, the idea that the Earth is a lot older than the biblical teachings would give us, that's been cast around by a lot of people, Graham Hancock included. But the idea of loam records, for example, giving indications that the biblical floods of Noah were actual events. And then you can see then where the idea of esotericism gets directly into play. Because if you say, okay, it's just a book, right? And then you zoom out and you say, okay, so it's just a series of books for dozens of religions and different sects across the planet expounding 5,000 years of human history. And zoom out again and you say, okay, it's the same story told over and over and over. So like, it doesn't surprise me necessarily that now we're approaching a point where again, we've got the Goths and again, we've got people rejecting the standard belief system in lieu of another. We have a youth-based revolution that was very much like 1968, but at the same time, we've got elements that are making it seem corporate or increasingly synthetic. Because when you ask people what they're actually upset about, people are saying they shouldn't have shot George Floyd like that. I can't tell you how many interviews I've seen from local newscasters. They didn't shoot George Floyd. Like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You're just angry. And the cycle keeps rotating so quickly, you never get to know what you're angry about. They'll find something else to keep you angry. They'll find something else to get you involved. It's like the articles you click on the most aren't the ones you want because you like what they're saying. It's the headlines that piss you off. Those are the ones you click on the most. Fact. So it's interesting once you realize that mimetically, you take 2 or 3 steps backwards and you say, how do I reach the most people? Unfortunately, it's not by being kind to them. And it's not by telling them, catering to what I would determine to be their delicate sensibilities. It's by telling them what they didn't want to hear, but you can prove. And that's unfortunately how a lot of these messages will keep getting pushed. Because if I keep telling you, okay, I understand you're easily upset. I understand you need to take it slow in order to embrace new ideas. If that's the pattern that's being given to you by one side that's trying to be rational, while another side is lying to you in ways that are potentially lethally dangerous, we're not all playing the same game. So I don't think I'm going to put on boxing gloves while they're hitting people with hammers. That doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to lessen my impact because for the sake of someone's feelings, when the other side, if you want to see it that way, I see it as 75% of the field right now is trying to lie to people to get them to buy shit.
Well, I would love to.
I want to talk about God a little bit and how I think God is really important for psychic health, and I think that people now are talking about defund the police, but what defund the police really means is we need more social workers or spiritual healers or people to be community leaders like priests may in some circumstances and religious figures. And if you listen to a lot of religious people or people who speak the language of the gods, like interpret the Bible through exegesis, you'll commonly hear things like they'll say, well, when God created the universe in 7 days, like a day isn't the same as one of our days. Like a day might have been millennia or several millennia, or it was in the Bible, because they had a poverty of language, they're using the best words at their disposal to show, okay, like there are these 7 sections that like our story divides the creation of the universe in. We're going to call those sections days, but then you have interpreters through exegesis saying, well, if we take into account what we know about the universe with modern technology and empiricism and the works, like we will now interpret these semantics like in their context, in our situationally aware context, right? As in a day is longer than a traditional day. Now, for community healers to be so adept at speaking according to semantics with the aim of social health, resolving tension, resolving conflict, like getting people not only comfortable speaking, but constructive speaking uncomfortable things, I think that it can feel like you're bowing to someone you don't like. as opposed to someone you do like. As in, it might be a lot easier to listen to someone you like who's like a religious figure interpreting something in a way that seems just kind of roundabout and indirect and unsatisfying, like how they're using language. It's a lot easier to listen to that person than to someone who you see as your opponent, or who's hurt your feelings, or who's done things that had the side effect of hurting your feelings or your psychic life, or like your social circumstances, whatever it is. Suddenly they're using some kind of postmodern exegesis on phrases that are promulgated through the mainstream media cathedral. And now, how do you respond? And there's different ways to respond to all these things. And what I reject is, I know some people will say that the goal of all this stuff is unification. It's all about unification, unification, unification. I like unification, but what I don't like is like this aim for homog, right? Like, you can be united, like we could be globally united and not homogenous at all, right? As in, you don't have to think of it as either competing strongholds, nations are competing strongholds, or we have a one world government. Like, you can have a laissez-faire, like economically free vision of unification where it's a byproduct of localism, non-homogeneous cultures. Like, you have a like a controlled flow of migration and immigration. And we are sharing an egregore on the internet, and so the mainstream media is lopsided, I think, in its control of the egregore, which is why we'll have Black Lives Matter protest over here, and you'll have riots and protests in other countries that it has nothing to do with, because it's really a symptom of this underlying discontent that I think is not being properly addressed. And I don't think you address it one way. You have to kind of do it very divergently.
I also want to quickly announce that we also have Kimberly Coulter joining us here for the discussion. Kimberly, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm always happy to be a part of this.
One thing that I wanted to get to with Gravantus is, even though I see, there being certain witches who want to hex Donald Trump, or, the people who talk about Harry Potter and Voldemort, I also see somewhat of an alliance between people who are more into the occult and people who are, let's say, tradcaths or traditional orthodox people like yourself, in terms of the things that you see as being harmful that you are rejecting, regardless of whatever differences happen to be in your faith. Gravantus, do you see this alliance strengthening in the things that people tend to agree with, regardless of religious faith, for the sake of creating a better world, instead of this world completely devoid of knowledge of anything higher?
I think there's a general trend towards, I would say, this almost return of, or at least acknowledgement of the spiritual deficit that exists in society as a whole. And I think the disparate groups are kind of all keying on into the same thing. I don't even know if I would say necessarily there's an alliance of sorts. I think it's just kind of everyone's converging and seeing the same thing. To what end I think everyone's working to might be different. But I think that's just kind of how I see it right now. And if I could just sort of jump off of something that Metanomad had talked about, this sort of idea of what's the solution to this. I was thinking, if someone had been in a coma for a year or something and they wake up, I think there was the climate change crisis. The world was supposed to have ended how many months ago by now, just of all the estimates they had, and they're waking up and now no one even talks about that. One thing that I think is important is just to disconnect from like all these impulses, the stimuli that keeps being shoved in your face all the time. Because once you disconnect, you kind of realize how little it matters, just on a personal level, because that's really the only thing you can change. I know one of the things that I do several times a year is I head off to a monastery. You get no cell reception. So, it's kind of, you literally can't be connected in that sense. And, you come back and, the same things are happening. You're like, wow, at the end of the day, this isn't really all too important personally. And just sort of that more inward looking to keep yourself sane, because you can't just have this constant stimuli and react to everything. You can't always react because that's what they want. They want a reaction, whether it's positive or the negative. That's the whole point of advertisement, whether it's for a product or for politics. They want you excited, whether in the positive or negative, because it gets you thinking about it. It gets you engage into it. They have you at that point. That kind of goes back to the idea of sort of these spiritual groups all kind of coalescing around the same thing. There's it's the idea of this almost psychic warfare that it's not so much that you're going to be rounded up and sent to a camp. It's they want control of your attention,
your mind becomes the camp.
Exactly. You can't get stuck in it. It's the mental prison idea.
And when you're in prison,
that's really what we have to escape from.
Prison.
Wait, you got cut off for a second. Can you repeat that, please, Tim?
I was just gonna say, in prison, people said it all the time. There's prisons, and then there's prisons. You put yourself in a deeper prison, the more shit you worry about. There were people I knew people that were doing 15-year bids that were smooth sailing, and I saw people that were doing 9 months that were shitting themselves, losing 10 pounds, hadn't paid in a week, and they were losing their minds. And it's like, well, why are you losing your mind? Because my cat and my dog and my mom and my ex-girlfriend and my job and my car. And where are you right now? But does any of that shit matter? What's your reality right now when you wake tomorrow? Like, what the fuck is wrong with you? What world do you live in? I mentioned this I think it was this podcast. I mentioned this before. Time is not linear. You simultaneously live in every event you've ever been in your whole life. And if I give you the right spiritualist encounter, I can rise a memory to the surface, and you can live in that one too. You can live in all these memories all at once. And how you change, how you become a different person, is to simultaneously be able to live in a memory of a dog biting you and pet a dog. Some people can't do that. Because they'll live that memory of the dog biting them for the rest of their life. And they'll say, oh, this dog can't go anywhere near dogs. Every dog I see now, it's going to be a big old problem. No, that's dumb.
In a way, that could be a version of hell in a way, and I'm not saying this would be the only way to perceive hell, but I could imagine it could be the combination of all the things that you have done that negatively impacted other people, and here you're finally realizing how it's negatively impacted the other people, and you are reacting to it for a very long period of time, like for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I mean, that's also DMT to some degree. I've known lots of people that have done dimethyltryptamine, and that was their trip experience. They saw experiencing the negative aspect of their own actions through other people's perspectives, and they were able to see it from an objective standpoint and go, wow, I'm the bad guy. Wow, I hurt people. Wow, I need to change. I mean, I hadn't experienced something like that. It wasn't on DMT, but still, it was on a hallucinogen, and it changed who I was a little bit, because I didn't want to be the person who couldn't differentiate between assertion and aggression to the degree that I hurt everyone around me, because I've been hurt before, and I don't want to be responsible for doing that to other people if I don't have to be. But sometimes you're going to force my hand. It's like the defund the police thing. All that really does is guarantee rich people can have private security, and every poor person's going to get fucked. And it's like, well, logically, take a step back. That's all it does. It's more anti-statist shit. If I was a foreign government, I would love to have a citizenry reject its own local government. I would love to have a citizenry say, we don't need to protect it, and just let the violence scramble, because all it's going to do is create more negativity and more tension. No one's going to want to join any sort of military to protect that country. They're going to say, look, they won't even protect me in my neighborhood. It's because I'm
it built a resentment between the citizens in that area. Like, there's already increased resentment towards the others. We talk about this so often on this podcast, where we itemize ourselves down to these very small groups, and it's an us versus them mentality, and now take away law enforcement from that equation, and you create the resentment of the people who can still afford to have private security, and that creates an even deeper and even more unmendable divide.
And by the way, we have a comment from Robert Kusk about Tim. He says, the deer guy is basically college-educated, less fat, leftist Alex Jones in a good way.
You should save that and put it on your bio somewhere.
I'm going to save that and put that somewhere.
Well, I like that you're known as the deer guy. I think that's pretty cool.
It's better than the deer dude from Twitch, you know what I mean? Zing!
But the other thing that I wanted to touch on is if we go back far enough to Socrates, he was complaining about the invention of writing because now people wouldn't store that much stuff in their heads. And this is a topic that I keep bringing up ad nauseum, having to do with all kinds of hidden abilities we may have. Like there's this kid I know, friend of the family, who came over. I put the mind fold on him, invented by Alex Gray. I use it for meditation. I put on him, and he was able to accurately describe the items in the room. So that to me tells me that there are these hidden abilities. The only question, and Maida, I'm very curious about your take on this too, because you had the interview with Mr. Greer where you talked about the occult as it is. It means hidden, and it's not necessarily evil, and it could be used for good. So the question is here, and I would love to get Gravantis' take on this as well. Where could be a good middle ground of letting people know that this stuff can be learned, and there could be higher levels of consciousness people could attain, while at the same time not having it flow into a very negative negative potential?
Yeah. Well, firstly, if you meet someone and the first thing you start to talk about is that they can attain higher levels of consciousness, they generally start to run in the other direction unless they're also fairly mad. First, I'll go through your points. Firstly, Socrates. Michel Serres says this in the Five Senses, but Socrates needs to shut the fuck up. Just in general, he spoke too much. He just kept going on. He had this idea that the oral tradition where everything had to be remembered, and this would have been done via Hermetic methods, which I spoke to John Michael Greer about on Friday. We had an interview about Giordano Bruno's De Umbris Idearum, where these aren't superpowers at all. Back in the Renaissance, people had to remember things, right? So the general idea is memory palaces, which a good overview can be found in Francis Yates' The Art of Memory, or Joshua Foer's recent The Moonwalking with Einstein, and these are fairly simple. But of course, what happens is if you don't use these faculties or these means to do these things, then which we don't because we've outsourced them to external devices which hold everything we need to know, which is ultimately a problem because ultimately you are reliant on whatever is given to you within the potential of those devices. So you can only really rely on what's allowed. So like once your memory is absolutely fried, like most people's is, then of course we can only really rely on these singular event presence to do it. Like we can only, it's like, for instance, the whole thing I make clear in the article about like everyone's forgot about Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion and like the Las Vegas shooting and I can't remember the other ones. I can't even remember the other ones, but I put in there because I can't remember them. Like my memory's that fried, and these things are forgotten about so quickly. And yeah, it's in part because everything's outsourced and held on databases, so we only need knowledge for the exact moment we need it. Right. And I do, personally, I think that's bad, but I think the thing is most people generally would have never had this much access to knowledge. Right. So it used to be that the people who had access to loads of knowledge were the people who would also be using it, professors or academics or people who were genuinely really interested. Other than that, you might have a newspaper or like a telegram or something. But now it's like you have absolutely everyone who has access to the most virile and like explosive headlines. Like there's people whose entire jobs it is to write like headlines which completely just deconstruct your will. So like in terms of saying they're superpowers, they're not superpowers. We've just lost our ability to use these things because we no longer need to, because we've put it all on phones and hard drives, etc.
I would add one thing, by the way. When you're talking about superpowers, I agree with you that memory is something that I wouldn't consider to be supernatural.
Well, no, but inherently anything that we can achieve with our body is not a superpower. And this is the whole thing that I go on about in Occultism 101. I don't even like the word occult because it springs to mind so many silly things. There's the whole like, oh, you're into that kind of stuff. Do you think you're Harry Potter? It's like, No, don't. Anything like that is not how it is. It's like, I don't know. If you practice Hermeticism, your mind's just going to get really sharp, and you're going to be calmer. If you practice the Lima, you're just going to direct your life in a certain way with more direction. You know, no one's out there like riding Baphomet into battle. These things, you know, I don't. Supposedly that happened to Crowley in the desert, but I don't. You know, that's maybe a subjective hallucination while he was taking peyote, but you know, that's not what this is about at all. It's about just, and I think there's going to be a huge rise in alternative religion as well, like in the coming years, because people are desperate for anything which isn't pseudo-democratic liberalism, but and postmodern culture on top of that. They are desperate for anything which has some clear cut, like I'm part of this, I'm part of this, I'm part of this, just to say that they're part of it. Even, you know, people are absolutely desperate, and we're already seeing that. Like I'm not like huge. I don't know too much about it at all. But like Satanists in America, like that's getting massive. You know, the Lima's on the rise again. Like Druidry's getting fairly big again. People are just generally getting interested in occult stuff again, and it's not because people want to like raise the devil. It's because everything else that's been offered to them is either been a watered down version of a previous religion, which is now just subsumed into the liberalist dynamic, like the Church of England, or it's just liberalism in general.
There's one thing I would add, though, and I'm curious where you would place it. I would not necessarily call this supernatural, but through my own experimentation with meditation, breathing techniques, I was able to generate three-dimensional images of a DNA helix around which was spinning this hurricane of what I would describe as like a tower shape, like a dome with a little spire on top of it, that I was able to, just by thinking about it, move around in 3 dimensions like I was playing around with Maya or something. So there are certain things that I think are attainable, that are beyond what people would necessarily think the human body is capable of. As far as where you want to place them, I don't know.
For sure, but this is scientism again. Like, you know, obviously my thing is continental philosophy, and one of the things continental philosophy is against is scientism, the idea that science is the best way to interpret the world in general. And it's that overarching and prevailing belief in a materialist scientific world, which basically is like, in terms of the herd and the mass, if something is outside of that, they'll be like, oh no. And it's like I said in one of my essays, free floating power, which is how so many things are justified these days, is people will say things along the lines of the scientists said, or science said, or the statistics say. And as soon as you say those things, basically all forms of responsibility and questioning and agency are gone, because you hear that word like, oh, it's science, it's fine. Well, what the hell does that even mean? You know, which scientists said it? Were they biologists? Are they physicists? There's massive, you know, to say, oh, the scientists said this about corona. Okay, great. Why do I care? You know, why? In what sense does that justify anything? You know, and since when did science become manipulated? They wouldn't go, I wonder if this could be X, Y, or Z. They'd say like, they'd instantly subsume it back into their framework and say like, oh, you must have had a chemical imbalance, or it must have been an illusion or a hallucination. And it's always something within there. And it's like anything which can't fit into that, it's just incorrect. And so yeah, that's, you know, but and anyone who then speaks out against that, it's the same thing as the Overton window. They're alienated simply because of the fact that they're outside of it, which is a frustration. But I will just say, I do just want to add that it's not just with forms of like alternative, in quotation marks, alternative spirituality. It's not just Satanism and occultism. You know, if someone says, I'm an Orthodox Christian and I contemplate or pray for 5 or 6 hours a day, people be like, what? This guy's really weird, you know? And it's like, why is that weird?
Yeah, why is it less weird to be on your phone the whole time playing Candy Crush Saga, and that's how you choose to spend your conscious life?
Well, you're contemplating and praying to some form of will there, you know?
You're praying to the candy gods, to the electric candy gods.
The disturbing thing about Candy Crush is how it's a closed system. Like if you are interacting with an open system with this same kind of intense focus, I don't think it would have the same degenerative effects than if you were just meditating in a closed system. But I think that's so, like, if you're gonna meditate in a closed system, you're much better doing the Wim Hof method with the Alex Gray mask and going into your mind's eye, because that I imagine would be an infinitely rewarding closed system, because it's like David Deutsch says, you have two types of infinities. You have limited and unlimited infinities. So an unlimited infinity would be like the infinity that exists between 0 and 1. Like you have 0.1, 0.11, 0.111. Like you could do that forever before you even got to 0.2, right? So he has a really good proof in his book called Infinity Hotel, where he describes the differences between unlimited and limited infinities. So the limited infinity is with real numbers. So it's very interesting to think about how you could actually have different types of infinities. My point is, it's related to how things in open and closed systems work as well. And I'm not that strong at articulating the connections, but I do think it would be helpful for people to recognize things that are just maybe uncomfortably different or divergent from you, and things that really are lobotomizing people in a way that is bringing us to a lowest common denominator.
I think these things could be pretty clear, at least from gut instincts, even though it could be wrong. Like if you are noticing some fad going around on Facebook where like a white woman would write like, I am a racist, I have always been a racist, and just start spouting all of these things that you can see where these branches come from very easily. And it goes back to the idea we talked about before of how are we able to bridge the divide between those people, and let's say bring on somebody here whose father like works at NPR, for instance, and just someone who is a Zoomer who may be disillusioned by the things that they're experiencing and may go into a much more extreme route. And being able to make sure that they don't do that, where there is a lot more nuance in what they're able to receive, sort of breaking the circles that exist already. But anyway, I wanted to bring this to Gio, who I know did not.
Do you mind if I just jump in
Go
on
for
something
it.
you said there?
Yeah.
Because I had a disagreement. You said about drawing people together, right? Bringing people, building bridges between camps.
Yes.
Like I see. This is an inherent problem that we have of this idea of like everyone has to be
not
together
everyone.
And everyone has.
It doesn't have to be
no,
everyone.
No. But you said no. For sure. But even some people, this idea that has to happen first, because this is on that idea of once again of Disneyfication. Like everything's either good or bad. Like if you're not building bridges, that means you don't want them here. It's like no. I never wanted anything to do with any of these people in the first place. You see what I mean? Like, just because you're not building connections between people and going towards homogeny doesn't mean that you want completely the opposite. It might just mean that you just want to be left alone and that you never wanted to be involved in any of this in the first place. So this whole idea of like, oh, we're all together, we're all in this together. I just think just because you don't do something doesn't mean that you're, or just because you don't do something doesn't mean you're against it, right? And that
Absolutely.
seems to be, yeah, but that seems to be such an overarching thing. And this whole idea of like togetherness and everyone has to be friends, it's the postmodern idea which is absolutely ruining everything. And it's one of the points I agree with Zizek on. Is like, it was brilliant when you had the authoritative teacher or father, because it's like, that's what I'm going to rebel against, that's what I'm going to push against. But the postmodern thing is the policeman's your friend. Like, have you noticed in these protests, no one knows who the fuck to go against, because everyone's trying to be friendly with everyone else. Like the police are friends with them and they're friends with the government, and the police, and then the protesters are also trying to kind of be friends with the government, but not some of the government, and some of the policemen, but not the firefighters, but they're also friends with them. And it's like, no one fucking knows what they're doing, right? Because the postmodern problem is everyone tries to be friendly with people so they can be coercive with them later. You know, it's like the teacher going, I'm your friend. And now the teacher's your friend. You feel bad rallying against them because, well, they're your friends. So it's easy to do what they say because, you know, we're pals. We're all friends here, but also still sit in this fluorescently lit room for 6 hours a day, right? And that's the postmodern problem is there is no longer a clear means of reaction or things to react against. And the more this happens and the more everything is just flattened onto a plane of like, you don't even know where you stand, that's the point where it's far easier to control you.
That is a very fair
with
point. Jules, hold on a
postmodernists-
second. I just
hold
want
on.
to address what Made a Nomad was talking about regarding like how I'm seeing what we're doing here. Where for me, it's more of a those who have ears will hear type of deal, where people have various things that they've encountered in the various circles, both online and off. For those who are interested, I would like certain gaps in their knowledge to be filled. And the reason why I would like that, especially for the coastal New York crowd, is because I live in New York. I like the restaurants. I like sushi. I like the environment there, even though I would want to have a place in the country later on. And for the sake of New York not becoming more of a socialist hellhole, I would want to bring certain knowledge to people that have been lacking it, that are in positions of authority. If it doesn't work, fine, but I still want to make the attempt.
I love that. I mean, I'm exactly in tandem with that. I mean, that's why we started this show, which has been a really masochistic endeavor for some of us. I think that, in my experience, though, it's the postmodernists that do the hazing before they're friendly, and it's the other way around with other people, as in, you know, it's like you can, some people might think of their process as like, here is the initiation process for like being on the inside. It could be like, if you can't navigate this minefield, if you can't get through this arduous passage in a text, like you can't get to the nougaty center and that kind of stuff. In my experience, it's not like people that are friendly first, like to then like be coercive, like you'll just, people just leave, as opposed to if you're unfriendly first, and then like there's like on and off periods of like you're hot, you're cold, you're hot, you're cold. I think that it's not so black and white, that a lot of people have very limited experiences with different types of people and divergent people. And if you think about how do we avoid this high sparrow situation all over the world, where you have something happen in America and then you have protests and riots like for the same event on the other side of the world, you need to look at how in herds and migrations, how you have these odd members out that are bizarrely not in lockstep with everything else. And they are starting to think that there might be like an evolutionary advantage to the herd, to divergent actors. And it can be similar to thinking about if you had a line of matches, right? And they're all like one's lighting, one's lighting, one's lighting, one's lighting, just pulling one match down, right? So that they're not all on the same level will stop the spread of wildfire. And so I think a lot of people, it's like we were talking about with the dogs earlier. Maybe they were bit by a dog and then they have no desire to be friendly with a dog afterwards. A lot of people kind of like to construct their identity. Like it's an aesthetic and spiritual process for them. And some people just by a matter of, I feel like it, right? As in a fail safe to like assure themselves that they have autonomy, that they're not brainwashed, that they don't have some kind of mind virus, that, you know, they're in control, they have control. Like, oh, it's the same kind of thing of people that just want to be racist because, you know, to them that's the sign that the government hasn't, you know, just taken over their mind or something. Or some people just don't want to like dogs because maybe they had a traumatic experience, maybe they never had a traumatic experience, they just don't want a partner that gets a dog and then suddenly they're picking up this dog shit, right? And it's like, this isn't what it's signed up for. Like, I don't want to be walking my dog everywhere. I'd rather have something like a cat that's less sycophantic but is equally affectionate on its own terms. And I think that, you know, we have to learn how to get along with differences. And
No, we don't.
you know, it's and if
Wait,
you're
wait, wait,
just
Jules,
afraid
Jules,
of
Jules,
power,
Jules.
you will be the person or the group that abuses it, and
I want to
you'll
get
be
Made a
none the
Nomad's
wiser.
reply.
No, I just getting on with difference. It's not. It's nothing. It's never for me been anything to do with the problem with differences, or I'm against them, or I want to destroy them. My problem is with the people who are saying, right, you need to do X, you need to do Y, you need to get on with this group, you need to assimilate into the group. Well, why? I'm just living my own life, and it's like I don't know, whatever you think of diversity, it's like you need to be more diverse. Well, I quite like where I live, and whatever happens happens. Why do I need to do all this other stuff? And this idea of the herd, and this idea of people beginning to have an understanding, I'm just so so almost die hard, I guess, like it's the wrong position to be in, but of the position of you can drag a horse to water but you cannot make it drink, and I've stopped caring about trying to get people to understand, because it's just an arrogant position. The herd is always going to be the herd. You can't have a herd without there being all those people who can be a herd. Now if they want to go off and do that, that's fine, but the whole idea of like, we need to learn from these differences, we need to get on with differences, it's like, for me, that I don't care about the difference or the other or whatever it is. That's its whole other thing. For me, is firstly is the question of control there, which is, well, why and who is telling me to do it and for what reasons? And it's like, it just seems to me an extremely humanist point of view, which is overlooking on so many other processes that are going on that most people don't want to know about this stuff. And like, it's like one of the first things they'll tell you, one of the first things in some really good business books, I mean, the Lean Startup is one, but this applies elsewhere, is you have to be able to say to people when you describe your business or what it is you're interested in, and to very quickly be able to say, it's not for you, right? Because if you have no understanding of the people it isn't for, then you have no clue who it is for, right? And I think that's something in life, is that we've been programmed to have this idea that everything has to be inclusive. Like, you start a little group, everyone has to be included. Like, oh, don't be mean, don't leave them out. It's like, it's not for you. All right, I'm reading these books on my own. They're my interests, and I don't care about anyone else. And I don't care if it's weird. And this is like my tips for getting out of the global lobotomy, is stop having that idea that the things you do have to assimilate into other people's interests. Why? Since when? It's not a question of not being sympathetic or empathetic to other people, the struggles of other people. But also, don't overextend your reach. No one can care about millions of people, right? Care about your neighbors and your family and your friends. Take sincere interest in them. Don't lie to yourself about caring about whole countries. That's mentally impossible. That's just
how is
madness.
that mentally impossible?
Well, how do you
It's
care?
called Dunbar number. Dunbar's number.
For all practical purposes, Jules. How do they? What I mean is, on a personable and, let's say, empathetic level, what does the phrase mean? Like, I care about this country. What is that achieving? What does it even mean? I just think it's a signaling lie. I get it. I get where these people are coming from.
Scale, right? Like not being an ideologue. You can be libertarian at a federal level, liberal at a state level, conservative at a local level, and socialist at a family level, right? And I think if you think in terms about like, love yourself, love your family, love your friends, love your community, love your nation, like they're different scales. And I think it is important to not get into this.
Sure, you could say this.
Like,
sure, you could say there's different forms of love on those levels.
Looking at just thinking about people as numbers on a page, you want to avoid that, but you want to make sure that like you do love your nation, because I believe it is an extension of you, whether you think of it that way or not, because people have been programmed to think they're not part of the weather, basically. Like all this stuff, all this postmodernism of there is no meaning, there is no truth, nothing matters, you don't matter, like Birdman, the unexpected virtue of ignorance, you know, this like emphasis on like things don't matter, you don't matter, nothing you do is really significant. Just like, you know, focus on your little plot to your isolated self and, you know, ignore the ripples you have. And it's backwards because we all have ripples. Everybody matters. We all matter. That's a matter of statement about significance, but it's also a statement about like physical existence. Like I do think we are made of material reality, and even the spiritual realm, I think, is an extension of material reality in a more ineffable state that we just don't have the knowledge and awareness to have better explanations for. And then that rabbit hole will go on, I imagine, infinitely, right? So it'll always be like an extropic process of
How can something matter if it's within an infinity? If there's no clear teleology, then how can something matter?
what do you mean if there's no clear teleology?
Well, if there's no clear, if
matter?
if it's finite and everything's going towards some form of ending, some form of conclusion,
No, I don't.
then your
what-
cog
I-
would
when I
matter. But
say
if it's in,
finite.
no, I just think we're going to have to agree to disagree here, Jules, because the language you're using with regards to matter, like it matters, it doesn't make any sense to me. Like, matters to who and to what? The cosmos?
I think that I think everything in some respects, I think everything matters in terms of significance and in terms of physical existence, but then it's all about scale, right? As in, not everything is equally as significant, but like significant is a word people created. It's a made up word, just like all the words we all made up, right? That's a tool to explain existence and objective reality. So the reason why people say there's no meaning is their argument is if people didn't exist, the human tool of language and meaning wouldn't exist. But the fallacy there is that existence, I believe, would still exist even if people didn't exist. So just because you didn't have the tool of meaning to describe it doesn't mean the things being described like don't exist.
But if you acknowledge that there's a scale of existence, then you must acknowledge that the very at one end of that scale is zero or no, it doesn't matter.
Well, zero is a concept, right? It's a hypothetical.
Okay,
that
but
helps
you're
us
in
do
a
math.
if you're
But
you're
that's why
conceptualizing of a
doing that in
scale and of
calculus, 'cause you can't
when
divide
you're
by zero.
acknowledging a scale, it goes from nothing to infinity. I don't know what other kind of scale you're operating on, but I don't see another. You're saying if people, places, and things can somehow, and events and whatever can somehow have more or less significance, then you're acknowledging that there are things that are not significant.
Insignificant in comparison, sure, or simply put, not significant. But again, this is I think semantics are really underrated. And I think that it's not fun for casual conversation, but for an elevated intelligentsia conversation like this one, I think it's the perfect place to make those distinctions.
Wait, Tim, you were saying something.
Yeah, look, and again, it's we can disagree, and that's fine. But I feel as if the terminology you used when you attempted to say that you can be socialist at a family level and nationalist or conservative at a community level, and it goes up from there. It's not what socialism even means. Like, that's not what that word means. And I understand that to you, nothing really has concrete meaning. But to me, things mean things, and you can't just objectively say, well, I feel like those words don't mean that right now. Because I don't play that fucking game. That's how we end up where we are right now with riots in 7 countries.
But
Like,
that's how a lot of the Bible works. That's how a lot of exegesis.
I didn't talk about the Bible. I'm talking about you and your direct interpretations of language and how I disagree with them and find them difficult to try to contend with. Because if you dislike an opinion, you will relate back to nothing as meaning. But if you believe something is important, you will try to shove it down someone else's throat about how significant it is and how, well, everything has to be equal and don't you care. Like, you have a completely non-fixed point of view that will float to whatever your current perspective is, and I find it frustrating to contend with ideologically because there's no consistency. So if you really believed these things, you would have your feet dug in the ground somewhere. The nihilism is irritating to a disturbing degree for me. Like there has to
I
be
don't
some
understand
purpose.
it's like the reason why you have I'm frustrated by the rise of socialism in New York City. We got AOC over here, we got de Blasio, we've got the DSA, and you have Bernie Sanders. And these talking points, like people have to think about like how populist debate even works, right? And you have to think about, okay, like we could have everything in an Oxford setting with, you know, people we approve of having a conversation, and there's a timer and there's a person going, oh, now it's this person's time to speak and this person's time to speak. Or then you start getting into the bombastic stage, like rabble rousing that you can get from like a Kanye West or anybody from like the Young Turks fields. And then you have to really start thinking about like how bodies move and what moves them. And I think that if you're listening to these people and not just listening to people you agree with all the time, like it'll really start to resonate like what the contention points are that I believe are resolvable past the conflict divisions. And they'll talk about the healthcare system in the UK, which you were talking about earlier. They'll talk about socialism in Denmark or in Norway. And what's absent from these comparisons, in my opinion, is and frequently the issue of scale, as in how socialism works in a family among 8 people who are like equally sharing resources is going to be different than how socialism works in a country that of 8 million people or 20 million people or 300 million or 8 billion,
But
right?
the family,
As in
but
the
the family doesn't have a
scale
government of people.
don't have
So like
Wait,
those
wait,
words don't make any
wait, Jules.
sense.
Yeah, Tim.
Like those words as you're using them don't make logical sense, because a family is not a government and a people. There's no taxes. It's a group of people trying to make it in whatever government they live under. So I can understand you could say, well, I guess it's socialist for me to bring home food and feed my wife and feed my dogs, but I'm not a socialist, and I'm not being socialist by fulfilling my family responsibilities that are outside of a governmental structure. Like I feel like
come up with this.
Who came up with it? Because that guy's wrong.
I don't think he is. I've heard many people talk about variations of that. That's from Nassim's Skin in the Game book. He's an Orthodox Christian. He's definitely on the right. But I think that if people don't respect how words really are, and you want them to be black and white, you like that is Ayn Rand is a perfect example of what goes wrong to a person when they only see the world in terms of black and white, and they're incapable of seeing shades of gray. And if you can't be comfortable
Jules,
with
do you mind if I just
context,
jump?
yeah, sure.
Jules, do you mind if I just jump in there? I mean, I don't want to like jump on you too much here, but there is an implication when you say that if someone is seeing the world in a certain way and that's incorrect, that does imply that there is therefore a correct way of seeing the world, which is completely what I'm against. Like if you're saying, sure, you could say that Ayn Rand, she I've got not very far into her books because I just think they're really badly written. But I understand the premise of her works, like extremely libertarian, highly pro-capitalist, a weird undercurrent of like domineering males and this strange fetishism for architecture, etc., etc. Like she sees it in a very binary manner. Fair enough, extremely libertarian, laissez-faire economics, blah blah blah. But if someone says that, oh, someone shouldn't see it in that way, they should see it in more shades of grey, it does apply a spectrum wherein she isn't on the wrong end of it, or there is some implication that understanding the world in a certain way is wrong, which then implies that you're saying that there is a certain way of seeing the world which is correct, or at least there is some domain of seeing the world which is correct, which is completely sort of what I'm trying to go against. Is like, no. And you also said earlier about people, we're trying to understand what people believe. Like the point I was trying to make earlier with the herd is these people neither believe or don't believe these things. It's just pure spectacle. It's empty filler, which is just filling up their time in their lives because they're getting drawn into it. When you truly ask people, like, have you got to sit down and after they'd sort of had their little paddy, like, do you actually believe this? They go, oh my God, of course. Once they calm down and you say, do you actually believe this? Like, think about it. Then you might get somewhere. But I don't think people are even like thinking They're just getting drawn in. That's the thing.
I have a quick question for Made a Nomad. Would you say
Uh,
through history there have been good examples of people who, let's say, weren't part of the masses, but were part of the elite that would have an influence on the masses, getting into conversations with people that would shift their perspective in such a way that at least society would become less, less bloody, that there would be less authoritarianism?
Oh, well, like so people who got drawn into like government and intelligentsia, but should have just been, shouldn't have gone that route.
I'd say more as far as, let's say, there being certain philosophers in the world who were friends with people who were higher up, and based on the conversations they had, those intelligentsia, elite, whatever you want to call it, people were able to make better decisions that would affect the world. As far as like they wouldn't put people
like who should they have listened to?
Well, I'm asking more not who they should have listened to, but how often is that the case that there are people out there that the elites do end up listening to, where maybe we could take that position up. Like, I'm not talking about influencing the mass
all the time, but it's the problem. Literally all the time. But the problem is that the elites are listening to them to use their work for the elite's preferred output and the elite's preferred system. My point is, like, I don't want this system. I don't want what you've given me. You know, that's the problem. So it's like, yeah, all the time people are being influenced by philosophers, and it doesn't matter to me. It's like, let's say for instance, I like Schopenhauer. I'm sure that at some point someone's been influenced, who's in power has been influenced by Schopenhauer, but he just used that for what he wants to do, which is fine.
And you don't anticipate there being a scenario where they could be influenced into making New York City less of a socialist state, less of a leftist state?
This is just gone into like the kind of politics that I don't like, though, because this is where you start using your energy to try and work out these things as opposed to just direct, because it won't sort anything out for you. Just don't. Firstly, before you're trying to, this is what I mean. It's like we're trying to sort out New York City when, I don't know, people who are listening to this, for instance, let's say that someone listening to this has a really, I don't know, I sound like Jordan Peterson now, but a really messy bedroom and their life's not really in order and they're unshaved and they're like, yeah, I'm going to sort out New York City. It's like, just take your energy, put it into yourself first, and then I'll listen to you. Right? And I'm not saying that I'm like some massive example of this. I'm just saying the whole thing of like, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It's like the kind of people who are in the streets smashing things up are not the kind of people I want to listen to, So it's like, and they're not the kind of people that I want leading me. So the point is about, I want someone who's personable and has really sorted themselves out and has become accomplished for themselves first, right? You can't, like to be fair, Jules, it's something you were saying earlier, is like you have yourself, and then that reflects to your family, and then that reflects to your nation. You can't just jump in at one end and say like, I'm going to sort out my nation, right? It's like a flow. Like you need to sort it out at the micro level first, and that then reacts into the macro as well. Like that's sort of going back to Socrates as much as I dislike him.
I agree, but there is also a question of access where, for example, I'm the chairman of the Art and Technology Committee at the National Arts Club in New York City around the Gramercy Park area. And there are a lot of people in there who would also, let's say, take something that I would give them as far as new information. Maybe they'll pass it on, maybe they'll keep it, maybe they won't. But just by the virtue of me being in that environment, I think, you know what, I'm going to work on my own stuff, but at the same time, if I happen to be talking with people, why not? Why not have a go at it and see if it could lead to something good as far as making New York City better?
Yeah, I think there's a landscape. I don't think there's any like one correct way or like one optimal way to live. And I think that's like been the fear of like people trying to do like a scientific religion or something. Like look at what happened with the Nazis, look what happened with the communists. And I think that